What began as quiet tension along NATO's eastern and northern borders suddenly transformed into one of the most dangerous military escalations Europe has witnessed in recent years, stretching from the battlefields of Ukraine to the borders of Poland, across the Baltic Sea, up through the Nordic region, and even reaching the airspace near the United Kingdom, as missiles were locked in targeting systems. Fighter jets engaged in high-risk aerial maneuvers, air defense, and electronic warfare radars were pushed to full alert, and tens of thousands of soldiers were placed on immediate readiness, turning what should have been a calm Christmas period into a loud and unmistakable war of nerves that carried very real consequences. Because this was not a training exercise or political theater, it was a live test of red lines, resolve, and reaction speed, unfolding just as the global spotlight remained focused on potential diplomatic talks involving Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and former U.S. President Donald Trump, talks that many hoped could signal a path toward de-escalation. But while the world watched the peace table, Vladimir Putin believed that intimidation through force would once again shift the balance in Russia's favor, particularly by pressuring NATO's eastern flank and especially Poland. Yet what Putin failed to account for was that Europe had fundamentally changed, and Poland was no longer a hesitant state hiding behind diplomatic statements, but a frontline power openly prepared to strike if necessary. And the moment Russian military activity came dangerously close to Polish airspace, diplomacy effectively ended and wartime protocols began, setting off a chain of decisions that would redefine Europe's security architecture. At the center of this escalation was Rzeszów Airport, a location that may seem ordinary on a map, but is in reality NATO's logistical heart, through which roughly 80% of Western military aid destined for Ukraine passes, making it one of the most strategically sensitive points in all of Eastern Europe. And when Russian missiles and drones approached the Polish border during Russia's massive overnight strike on Kyiv, Polish military leadership made a historic and extremely risky decision by shutting down the airport to civilian traffic, effectively declaring that this was no longer a civilian logistics hub but a military zone. A move that carried serious consequences because even a short disruption could have caused delays in the flow of ammunition, vehicles, and supplies to Ukrainian forces. Yet Warsaw accepted that risk in order to send Moscow a clear and unmistakable message that any violation of Polish airspace would instantly escalate the conflict. And almost simultaneously, over the Baltic Sea, a Russian reconnaissance aircraft encountered something it had not expected, as instead of receiving a routine warning or distant escort, it found itself locked onto by Polish F-16 fighter jets in the darkness, forcing the Russian pilots to change course, an encounter that was not symbolic but operational, signaling that Poland was prepared to use force if pushed further. And this posture did not appear overnight, but was the result of weeks of preparation and a dramatic shift in strategic thinking. Earlier in December, Polish General Yaroslaw Gromyszynski openly abandoned the language of diplomatic caution and replaced it with blunt deterrence, stating that if Poland were forced to act, it would strike everything within 300 kilometers and ignite targets as far as 900 kilometers away, a statement that effectively redrew Poland's red lines and marked a historic moment in NATO's posture. Because for the first time a member state openly described a preemptive and deep strike doctrine against Russian territory. And to understand how seriously this statement was meant, one must examine the critical 72-hour window that began on December 24th and peaked on December 27th, during which Russia attempted a complex and coordinated military demonstration designed to test NATO's entire defense network from north to south. The first phase of Russia's plan unfolded quietly but dangerously on Christmas Eve, as Russian Tu-95 MS strategic bombers, aircraft capable of carrying nuclear weapons, conducted aggressive flights near British and Norwegian airspace over the North Sea and Norwegian Sea, forcing the Royal Air Force to scramble Typhoon jets and prompting Norwegian F-35s to intercept, a maneuver that served as a classic diversionary tactic intended to pull NATO's attention northward, stretching its response capacity and creating the impression of a wider threat, while Russia prepared its main pressure point elsewhere. And although these encounters ended without weapons being fired, the risk of miscalculation was extremely high, with multiple aircraft operating in close proximity under tense conditions, setting the tone for what would follow. As NATO's northern flank absorbed this pressure, the focus shifted decisively toward Poland on the morning of December 26, when radar systems detected a Russian Il-20 electronic intelligence aircraft flying in international airspace, but close enough to probe Polish defenses. And this aircraft was not carrying bombs or missiles, but sensors designed to map radar frequencies, reaction times, and air defense coverage around Rzeszów, information that would be critical for any future strike. And, under normal circumstances, such a flight might have been shadowed and escorted away. But Poland responded in a way that went far beyond routine procedure by scrambling its most advanced F-16 Block 52 Plus fighters, aircraft optimized for air superiority and precision missions, and according to field reports, these jets were supported by Dutch F-35s, forming a powerful fifth-generation NATO air presence that effectively sealed the sky. And when the Polish fighters locked radar onto the Russian aircraft, the encounter shifted from monitoring to confrontation, forcing the Russian pilots to retreat, making it clear that Poland would not tolerate reconnaissance aimed at its most sensitive military infrastructure. The real shock, however, came later that night when Russia launched one of its largest missile and drone attacks of the year against Kyiv, firing around 500 Shahid drones alongside dozens of Kh-101 cruise missiles, creating a massive aerial assault designed to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses and send a psychological message to both Kyiv and the West. And as these weapons moved westward through Ukrainian airspace, Poland's military leadership faced a critical decision point, knowing that any malfunctioning missile or deliberate deviation could cross into Polish territory. And rather than waiting passively, Poland preemptively activated its defense protocols, closing Rzeszów Airport, scrambling jets, and placing air defense units on full combat readiness. While on the ground, despite the Christmas holiday, Poland put approximately 20,000 troops stationed along the Belarus and Ukraine borders on high alert, activating the Eastern Shield project in its full operational mode for the first time under real threat conditions, including anti-tank trenches, dragon's teeth obstacles, reinforced fortifications, and AI-powered sensor towers designed to detect movement, vehicles, and infiltration attempts in real time, demonstrating that this was not a symbolic show of force, but a fully integrated defensive system prepared for immediate escalation. Behind the visible military activity, however, was an even deeper intelligence and diplomatic struggle that had been unfolding quietly for weeks, because Poland's confident stance on December 26 was built on a deliberate campaign to dismantle Russia's intelligence network inside the country, a campaign that culminated in the closure of Russian consulates in Poznan and Gdansk, which Polish authorities accused of operating as espionage hubs rather than legitimate diplomatic missions, with Gdansk in particular serving as a critical signals intelligence center monitoring NATO naval activity in the Baltic Sea and tracking rail lines and logistics routes feeding supplies into Ukraine through Rzeszów. And when Polish investigations into railway sabotage and arson attempts uncovered links back to these consulates, Warsaw concluded that Russia was engaging in state-sponsored terrorism, leading to their closure, a move that effectively blinded Moscow's intelligence-gathering capability within Poland, forcing Russia to rely on riskier aerial reconnaissance missions like the IL-20 flight, which Poland then blocked, sending an unmistakable message that Russia would not be allowed to regain situational awareness either on the ground or in the air. Russia's response to these closures was weak and asymmetrical, limited to shutting down the Polish consulate in Irkutsk, a location of cultural and historical importance, but little strategic value, highlighting the imbalance in the intelligence exchange and reinforcing the perception that Poland had gained the upper hand in the shadow war. And this intelligence blackout significantly weakened Russia's position just days before potential diplomatic engagement, because Moscow's strategy relied on using shock and awe to intimidate Ukraine and pressure the West ahead of negotiations. Yet Poland's firm response ensured that logistics resumed quickly after the temporary airport closure, panic was avoided, and the psychological momentum shifted toward Warsaw, as Russia's missile campaign failed to achieve its broader strategic objective. This shift in momentum reflects a much larger transformation in Poland's strategic posture, as the country moves decisively from a defensive buffer zone to an active frontline power, particularly in relation to Kaliningrad, the heavily militarized Russian enclave on the Baltic Sea, which Poland increasingly views not as an untouchable threat, but as a vulnerable and isolated pocket surrounded by NATO territory. And through stricter border controls, customs restrictions, and logistical pressure, Poland has begun economically suffocating the region, causing concern among local residents who increasingly fear Moscow's mismanagement more than NATO's military capabilities. While militarily, Poland's fortifications along the Belarus and Kaliningrad borders are designed not just to stop tanks, but to completely isolate the enclave in the event of conflict, turning what was once considered a Russian dagger aimed at Europe into a strategic liability. One of the most significant developments during this escalation was Poland's practical testing of a doctrine that had previously been debated but never fully implemented: the idea of intercepting Russian missiles while they are still over Ukrainian airspace, rather than waiting for them to approach Polish territory. And the preemptive scrambling of Polish jets during the December 26th attack served as an implicit test of this approach, extending Poland's defense perimeter eastward and integrating it directly into NATO's broader air defense network, creating a nightmare scenario for Russia, whose missiles now must penetrate not only Ukrainian defenses, but also Polish and NATO systems layered together, significantly reducing their effectiveness and increasing the risk to Russian forces. Russia's attempts to counterbalance this shift by deploying advanced missile systems to Belarus have done little to change the strategic equation, instead reinforcing Poland's determination to strengthen its strike capabilities and deterrence posture. And the transformation of the Suwalki corridor, once considered a potential weak point vulnerable to Russian attack, into a heavily fortified and monitored zone underscores this change, especially as Russia has been forced to redeploy troops from Kaliningrad to cover losses in Ukraine, leaving the enclave more exposed at a time when Poland is openly signaling its willingness to act decisively. And as the gap between Kremlin rhetoric and battlefield reality widens, Warsaw has abandoned diplomatic ambiguity in favor of clarity, speaking the language of force that Moscow understands, backed by concrete military, intelligence, and logistical measures. In the end, the events surrounding December 26th represent a turning point in Europe's security order, demonstrating that Poland is no longer content to react defensively to threats, but is prepared to confront them at their source, rewriting the rules of engagement by blinding Russian intelligence operations, blocking aerial reconnaissance, protecting critical supply lines, and openly threatening deep retaliation if provoked, while Russia's attempt to intimidate through missile strikes instead exposed its limitations and strengthened NATO's resolve. And the runway lights that went dark at Rzeszów that night were not a sign of weakness or fear, but a warning flare signaling the end of the gray zone that had long defined relations on NATO's eastern edge, marking the rise of a hardened frontier where red lines are enforced with steel rather than statements, leaving a dangerous question hanging in the air. Will Russia accept this shift and absorb the humiliation, or will it gamble on a more aggressive move through Kaliningrad or elsewhere? Because history shows that cornered powers often resort to their most dangerous actions when options run out. And we want to know what you think about where this confrontation is heading, so share your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to stay updated with us latest analyses and breaking global developments.